Linux on UEFI, how to reboot to the UEFI setup screen like Windows 8 can? Makersov.com explains that Windows 8 certified hardware has a new way to enter the UEFI setup screen, equivalent to BIOS. From how to access the BIOS on a Windows 8 computer. No longer do we press a certain key during the boot process to reveal the BIOS. Instead, an option to access the BIOS is located in Windows 8's Boot Options menu. If you're just here to access your computer's UEFI BIOS, click the Troubleshoot tile. The main developer of Secure Boot for Linux says that alternative OSes can't assume the old way will continue to work. So does Linux also have a new way to enter UEFI setup? I have an Asus motherboard. It suggests that an upgraded version of the firmware contains a fast boot option. The flip side is that the option might make it even harder to reveal the BIOS than it already is. I don't mind tinkering. Just if this is known to be a bad idea, I don't want to go through the risk of a firmware upgrade for nothing, and maybe have to pop the case off, reset the settings and have to set them all up again. Alternatively, how is this handled for Windows 7 users? If they optimistically select the fast boot option, how do they get access to the BIOS setup again when they need it?
On modern Linux distributions using systemd, you can go straight to the firmware setup menu using documentation, this URL.
I've written a small tool to do this without systemd, this URL.
I'm not sure how exactly Windows and NBSP 8 does this, but I can guess that it takes advantage of UEFI variables used for boot options. You can use reboot to determine the meanings of the various boot variables. On my system, boot 0000 is set up, so using reboot and 0 should cause the system to boot into setup on the next boot.
I have tried UEFI booting with Ubuntu 12.04, and found an answer to my own question. I haven't upgraded my firmware. I must read the release notes originally, it probably wouldn't be any faster. Entering firmware setup from the grub UEFI boot menu. UEFI bootware doesn't seem to support rebooting to firmware setup for me. But grub UEFI does. It's able to create an entry for firmware setup in the grub boot menu. You can enter the grub boot menu by holding down the shift key early in the boot process. I press it down immediately after the numlock light turned on the keyboard, and that works for me. If you're curious, I looked at the command as well, it's full setup. I.e. you can enter the grub menu, follow the on-screen instructions to switch to the command line, then type full setup and hit return. If you do an UEFI install from scratch, I believe the menu item will be created automatically. I didn't install as UEFI, which meant I had to kick it. See below. Step 4. Converting from BIOS GPT boot to UEFI GPT boot without burning an UEFI boot CD? Edit, this section may work on some systems. However, I now believe it relies on extra behavior which is not part of the UEFI standard. Someday I'll figure out what's happening here. I was converting an existing install to UEFI, without an UEFI enabled boot CD. Some people think this is impossible. Admittedly, there are a couple of confusing warning messages. I had a look at what was going on. If you can currently enter the firmware setup, then it's not all that bad. The hard part is you're probably still using an MBR partition table, and you almost certainly need to convert it to GPT. I'm not going to cover conversion from MBR to GPT. Partitioning is always a bit dangerous. Disk can convert, but there are quite a few fiddly bits. I haven't listed them all here. But for one, you probably need to shrink the last partition, to make space for the end of disk GPT. You can't do that if the partition is mounted, so you'll want to use a boot CD. I also staged the conversion, making sure I could boot from BIOS GPT before I tried UEFI GPT, which involved having to create yet another type of boot partition. Assuming you've got GPT set up, install grub EFI. This removed grub PC, and stopped it from working. Grub EFI actually still worked after I removed it. Fedora seems a bit different, I've only tried this on Ubuntu. During the install, you will see errors about not being able to access EFI variables, which is because you didn't boot by EFI. Shutdown. Power on. Make sure you boot through EFI. This is a system dependent and worrying part. My system happened to default to MBR boot to start with, so I saw a scary error from grub, but it was from the old grub PC. On my system, it was easy to enter the firmware setup screen at this point, see below, and change the boot priority to Ubuntu, which was the entry for booting my OS via EFI. Now you can redo the grub installation, grub install, or grub to install on Fedora, and it won't show any errors. And now, running update grub, or grub-tune config o/boot/grub/grub.cfg, on Fedora, will create the menu item for entering firmware setup. Entering the firmware setup/boot menu on my ASUS system. Disclaimer, this is not the very latest firmware/board. Your ASUS system may act differently from mine. My current ASUS firmware notices when the boot configuration has changed, for example when I installed grub EFI. There's text saying that it's changed if you look at the initial easy setup screen. And, when it detects such a change, it makes it easier to enter the setup screen. What it does is it shows the splash screen with press del to enter setup for a few seconds. If you've enabled the fast boot option, it normally skips the splash screen. I think it's also possible to trigger the splash screen by you powering off the system and unplugging it for a minute or so, before rebooting. On my current firmware, I can enter the firmware setup by blitzing the del key during boot, even without the splash screen. However, this is conditional on enabling keyboard support in the firmware. It's possible to switch the firmware not to probe for keyboards during boot, which is supposed to speed things up. I guess this is the next experiment to try, now I'm more confident about this EFI stuff. It's plausible it could kill keyboard support in the grub boot menu as well. But I should still be able to use grub set default, so that grub boots the full setup entry, and recover that way.
If you want to support the channel, please consider subscribing.